Energizing, mobilizing, and finding triumph for the Patriot cause. Spoiler alert, the Patriots win the American Revolution. Going all the way back to pre-revolution, pre-declaration, if we look at something like the Stamp Act, it's almost impossible to forget what patriotic leaders like Benjamin Franklin did for the Patriot effort. It's Franklin who's one of the first to say to the British, if you choose to tax us, give us members of your legislature and let us be one people. In other words, no taxation without representation. Down in Virginia, it's a little more radical. Patrick Henry publicly criticizes the Stamp Act in the House of Burgesses, compares George III to Charles I, and that is not a glowing comparison. Charles I is the guy whose absolute monarchical tendencies led to the English Civil War. In places like Boston, you have groups like the Sons of Liberty, which really are disciplined, organized mobs of laborers, of artisans, of common people. And they're destroying property. They're forcing the resignation of stamp collectors. All of this is done and encouraged by prominent merchants, people like lawyers John Hancock and John Adams. Hancock himself was also a merchant and stood to benefit a great deal from things like the American non-importation agreements. If we jump to immediately the days after the Declaration, we can see that the colonists are taking up arms against even symbols of British rule. New York colonists destroyed a statue of English monarchy in New York City, pulled down a statue of the king, and they even melted it down to make bullets for the war. This is actually from a French newspaper, and you can see the French depiction, probably inaccurate, of the New Yorkers having slaves pull down the statue. Let's also talk about shortages. Let's talk about that British blockade, the naval blockade of American ports and the coast. Because when we look at the blockade and its effects, we can really see efforts by a number of different American groups to continue the war effort. The British blockade created shortages during the war. It cut off American ports, cities, and people from manufactured goods from Europe. It also disrupted major industries like whaling and fishing. And the British even occupied some of the ports, and that's going to cause further problems for people in those areas. What adjustments did the Americans make? Well, they moved inland. Patriots moved inland and sought support from their fellow Americans further away from the coast. And people further away from the coast switched what they did. For example, farmers in the Chesapeake region went from growing the very profitable tobacco to growing wheat to feed the armies of the American Revolution. Here we see an engraving of Molly Pitcher loading that cannon after her husband was wounded. Did most women do this in the war? No. But many women did take over family businesses and family farms as their husbands went off to serve. How else did the public support and assist the war effort? Well, we can see that with just donations and supplying goods and supplies to the military. During the war, the Connecticut government asked the public for coats and shirts, and the people of Connecticut answered that call. In New Jersey, women pledged to make 100,000 yards of cloth to support the war effort. How else did they assist the war effort? Well, it became even more formalized. In some New England states, they attempted to impose price ceilings. During a war, prices can go very, very high, and that can create all kinds of problems. So the New England governments tried to impose price ceilings to prevent skyrocketing prices from making the war effort unpopular. And Patriot committees of safety were organized throughout the country to try to maintain support for the war, to collect taxes to support the war, and even seize property of some loyalists. Now, this is often seen as going too far and leads to some backlash in some parts of the country against the Patriot cause. Okay, again, spoiler alert, the Americans win the American Revolution. So how? We've talked about the British advantages. How the heck did the British manage to lose this war? Well, there's some tactical mistakes and strategic mistakes made by the part of British generals. They could have pursued and wiped out George Washington in 1776. In 1777, British leadership could have coordinated their military efforts better and worked better together. And the decision to march into Patriot-controlled Virginia in 1781 really hurt the British war effort. So a lot of big mistakes made on the part of British generals, whereas Washington isn't perfect, but he avoids making any large catastrophic mistakes. He takes a very defensive strategy throughout the war. He minimizes casualties. He works on maintaining morale of his troops and the country, and holds out hope that they'll gain support from somebody like France, which they did. Also, Washington benefits from local support. There is no organized loyalist militia forces operating in the United States during the American Revolution. And Patriot militiamen were the difference in some major battles like Saratoga and some important battles in the Carolinas. Finally, we shouldn't forget the efforts made by everyday citizens, especially economic efforts. Soldiers who signed up for the war and farmers who sold goods to the war and food to the war accepted continental currency, accepted the money issued by the Second Continental Congress, even though those continentals, that currency, was rapidly depreciating. It looked like it had no value and it was getting worse. Nonetheless, people put those concerns aside and accepted this dwindling currency for their goods or for their services, and that was huge to the war effort.